That's what America is about. And we're lowering that trajectory. We're lowering what we're teaching them. By 8th grade, basically, Common Core is about 1 to 2 years behind what children in high-performing countries are learning. They're already off the pathway to being prepared to study the STEM subjects in college: science, technology, engineering, and math. That's how bad Common Core is. It locks children into an inferior education. In terms of English language arts, as Jamie said, we're pushing in a severe reduction in classic literature in favor of dumbed down, mostly dumbed down informational texts. We're not even teaching cursive writing. And we're talking about teaching children instead to be global citizens. So last year, my son, who was 8 years old at the time, went on a class trip to a NASA facility, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So I was pretty happy about that. So he's going to go learn. Maybe this will heighten his interest in the solar system, the sun, the moons, the stars, the planets. And he came back with some literature. He came back with this from NASA. NASA seal on the back. It is a carbon footprint estimator. And it asks questions. And really, these questions are undermining my authority as a parent. These are all values questions. How often do you eat animal-based products? How often do you travel in a car each week? How often do you carpool? How often do you use public transportation? How many times do you fly in a plane each year? Do you save electricity in your home when possible? What type of house does your family live in? How often do you recycle? This is the federal government run amok. And this is a recurring theme in this conference. What we've done is we've grown the federal executive branch to be so large that there's no check or balance over it. Congress is incapable now of providing any substantive authentic check or balance. And it is even, especially in education, it's to the point where you can't even reasonably, as a citizen, sort out what's coming from the federal government and what's coming from the state governments. The policies are being pushed in from the federal government to the state executives, and the state executives adopt it as their own and basically pass that off to legislators as, hey, we looked at this, this is our view that this is the best thing that we could do. That's how Common Core came in. Initially, not a single state legislator even looked at it.
I want to kind of build off something that Stanley Kurtz mentioned and that Anne-Marie has touched on here too with this workforce development. So the uniqueness of this country. Alexis de Tocqueville was a French aristocrat. He came and visited the United States in the 1830s. He ultimately wrote a very impressive 2-volume history of democracy in America. What is the uniqueness of this democracy? Well, unlike his experiences in Europe and throughout most of the world, he observed that the uniqueness was that the citizens and civic organizations at the local level really drove most of the ideas and the decision-making. That was the uniqueness. It wasn't like kings and queens and czars and ministers making decisions from on high, right? And no institution in our public life has played a bigger role in driving that outlook than our public schools. The reality of it is that whether you're talking about Thomas Jefferson or George Mason or John Adams, the state constitutions are lengthy and specific about K-12 education and the responsibility of future legislators to support and direct it, primarily to develop citizens, right? Now, what Anne-Marie has said really is true here, that there's a seismic shift going on. This push towards workforce development really is kind of more of a European model. President Obama, several times in State of the Unions, has talked about this, how we need to be emulating the way they educate kids in Germany, where there are these specific tracks, and that basically bureaucrats are picking and choosing and directing kids into college or career, without really the input from parents. The folks that are driving the Common Core, this is their worldview. This is what they have been pushing for 20 some odd years. Achieving, the Council of Chief State School Officers, the Governors Associations, they're workforce development folks. It doesn't really matter what party you're talking about, that's their outlook. They think that they think incorrectly, that the function of K-12 education is not to perpetuate the principles of our constitutional republic the way the founders did. They think it's to establish a nationalized system so that bureaucrats can pick and choose and direct kids to particular kinds of careers or jobs. That's what they really believe. They've been overt about this for quite a long time. They've tried it in fits and starts, going back to at least the early 1990s. There's a report that was written by Mark Tucker. I know he's been in New Hampshire quite a lot in the last several years, but Mark Tucker is part of a group of folks that have really held this idea of sort of workforce development as sacred to the future of K-12 education. And he wrote a letter and an accompanying report. It's called the Dear Hillary letter. He and a handful of other folks who are still connected with Achieve and a lot of these DC-based players, they wrote a letter to then recently elected President Clinton and his wife. And they sent it to the governor's mansion in Arkansas in 1991 or 1992 before the inauguration. And what it did is it just outlined in lots and lots of details. It's a 60 or 70 page letter, and it maps out exactly what they're now trying to do, which is that there'll be a kind of nationalized outlook. They'll have a national database. They'll work in conjunction with the U.S. Department of Education and the Department of Labor to have kind of nationalized databases on kids where they will be making the decisions based on what they think. I mean, the idea of it alone is certainly anti-constitutional. But the thing that's remarkable is that in the 20-some-odd years since they first began to push for this in the Clinton administration, they haven't had any success anywhere. The rest of the country, states like Massachusetts and New Hampshire, have just continued to do well, ignoring that kind of top-down approach, focusing on the liberal arts, focusing on high-quality mathematics, making sure that their kids have the same kinds of knowledge and access to the same academic content that the high-performing countries in the world. That's how you do it. And you make sure that the people who are paying for the work, and 90% of the funding in this country for K-12 education comes from the state and local government. The federal government actually has a very small financial footprint on top of the legal limitations on it. What we know from Massachusetts, and it certainly is even truer in New Hampshire, is that when state legislators and local elected officials can control this work, that you tend to do pretty well because, as the founders well understood, you want to have K-12 education serve as a kind of wellspring to perpetuate the principles of this country. So when Anne-Marie talks about this seismic shift away from not only federalism and a kind of limited view of what the U.S. Department of Education is supposed to do towards sort of workforce development, it aligns directly with what Stanley was saying in his remarks too. This is the tradition of our country, folks. If you lose this, all the other things, they don't matter. Because if they have control over the ideas that you're being taught to your kids, whether it's through the AP or the SAT or a couple of consortia, testing consortia that are controlled by the federal government, they just cut you out of it. This one really matters because all the other things that our kids learn about this country turn on what it is that they're taught in their schools.
So this big federal overreach started in 1965. It was the basic, what we now call No Child Left Behind. It was the first of President Johnson's great society programs. He got it through Congress when he had 2/3 majorities in both houses. And all we've done since then is just pass it again, and if not, make it worse. So when President George W. Bush took office, he reauthorized it under the name No Child Left Behind, and he made it more oppressive with more strings tied to the states. Now, Republicans have strong majorities in both houses. And what are we doing? We're reauthorizing No Child Left Behind. There's a rush. And I should point out, No Child Left Behind, the initial reauthorization ran out in 2007, 2008. So it's been unauthorized, officially unauthorized since then. Now the Republican leadership is in a rush to get it reauthorized and get it to the president's desk so he'll sign it. And they've said that. We want to get the president a bill that he will sign. So it's rather than wait a year for the next election and hope that there's a better president who's more respectful of the people and their rights. Leadership is saying things like, well, we're putting protections in there to protect the states. The fact of the matter is, most of those protections were already in No Child Left Behind, as Jamie noted.
Croc TV.